Hey everyone, and welcome back to the MCAT Prep Pod Biology Review. In this episode, we're going to cover the human reproductive system, its hormonal control, and puberty. I'm glad you're tuning in to study with me today, and I have to say it's good to be back. I have been so excited about this series. It's nice to finally have time to re-record all my old outdated episodes and get them back to where they can be useful to people. If you haven't yet, please come by the website reviewmcat.com and check out the notes set and also the Quizlet flashcards that I put together for the episodes. They have important figures, diagrams, and the flashcards are great for remembering those keywords and definitions. And while you're there, you can check out what other series we might have available at this time. So, also feel free to drop me a line, leave me some feedback, mark@reviewmcat.com. Tell me what you like or what you don't like. I love to get some feedback so it can help shape future episodes. All right. That's it for the announcements. Today, we're going to cover how sex is determined. We're going to cover the male and female sex anatomy, how gametes, that's sperm and eggs, are formed. We're going to talk about the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis controlling all of that, and the menstrual cycle and puberty. So there's a lot to cover today, so let's get into it. We talked previously about chromosomes. In humans, we have 23 pairs of them, and it's the 23rd pair that determines your sex. The last chromosome pair is unique from the others in that it's not necessarily homologous. So one is always an X chromosome, and that's inherited from your genetic mom, and the other is either an X or Y chromosome, and that's inherited from your genetic dad. So that's XX for females and XY for males. Because males have only one chromosome, they're sometimes called hemizygous for genes on the X chromosome. So that means they only have one copy. And this is why X-linked traits like red-green colorblindness or hemophilia are much more common in males than in females, because they don't have that backup X chromosome to mask a faulty gene. The Y chromosome that males do have, while smaller, it contains the crucial sex-determining region, or SRY gene, and that kicks off male development. So the presence of this gene is what determines sex. So in very rare genetic instances where an individual has two X chromosomes and a Y chromosome, remember there are meiosis errors, non-disjunction, and we talked about that last episode, and so this can happen. And if this happens, the individual is actually born a male because they have a Y chromosome. Now, in a male, the primary sex organs are the testes, which are located in the scrotum. The scrotum, being sort of outside the core body, keeps the testes at a little bit cooler than the core body temp, which is optimal for spermatogenesis, which is the process of making sperm. It's kind of a mystery to me why our bodies couldn't adapt that process to be a few degrees higher, but instead opt to keep the scrotum on the outside, where it can be very easily, painfully, and humiliatingly injured, but I guess nature has a sense of humor maybe. Anyways, inside the testes there are two main components, the seminiferous tubules and the cells of Leydig. Now, the seminiferous tubules are where the sperm is actually produced. The sperm are nourished there by Sertoli cells within the tubules. So Sertoli cells are like sperm support cells. The interstitial cells of Leydig are cells that are between the tubules. They're interstitial, that's in between, and they produce testosterone and other androgens, which are the primary male sex hormones. And we're going to come back to this in more detail later on when we move on to the endocrine system. Now, after the sperm are made, they move into the epididymis. This is a coiled tube at the back of the testes, and this is where sperm are stored after they're made. And it's importantly where their flagella gain motility and they learn how to swim. So the sperm basically just chill out there waiting and ready to go for an ejaculation event. Now during ejaculation, sperm are moved from the epididymis up the vas deferens, or ductus deferens, and this muscular tube travels up from the scrotum into the pelvic cavity and eventually merges with the duct from the seminal vesicle to form the ejaculatory duct. And this short duct passes through the prostate gland and empties into the urethra. Now the urethra, which runs through the penis, is the final pathway out for both urine and semen. though of course both not at the same time. So you really need to look at the diagram for this in the show notes. I know it's kind of hard to picture everything from my okayish descriptions, but there's a diagram there in the notes just to get an idea of where everything is. Now, during ejaculation, sperm get mixed with seminal fluid from the accessory glands. Now, these glands are the seminal vesicles, which are near where the vas deferens join the ejaculatory duct. They add a fluid rich in fructose, which is sugar that the sperm need for energy on their journey. The other accessory gland is the prostate gland, which is located directly below the bladder and that's surrounding the urethra. It adds a milky, slightly alkaline fluid which helps neutralize the acidic environment of the vagina, which help the sperm to survive. The third accessory gland is called the bulbourethral gland, or the Cowper's glands, which are kind of outside the urethra pathway near the base of the penis, and they produce a clear lubricating fluid before ejaculation that cleans out any urine residue that might be still in the urethra. So just to recap the gland's functions, the seminal vesicles give fructose for energy, the prostate gland makes it alkaline for survival, and the bulbourethral gland lubricates and cleans, and all of that fluid plus the sperm is what equals semen. There's a pretty common mnemonic for this, for the sperm pathway during ejaculation, and that is 7 up. So, just going through it, it's SEVENUP, so S for seminiferous tubules, that's where sperm is made, E for epididymis, where sperm is stored, V for vas deferens, where transport is after the epididymis, E for ejaculatory duct, where the prostate is, and in this acronym, the N is just for nothing. It's just to make the 7 up. U for urethra, which is the last tube going out, and P for penis, where the sperm exit. So that's 7 up, and you definitely want to know that pathway. The first few parts of that are for storage and maturation, and the rest is during ejaculation. Okay, let's take a closer look at spermatogenesis, and that is making sperm in those seminiferous tubules. So this process starts at puberty and it continues lifelong. It begins with spermatogonia, and these are diploid stem cells. They undergo mitosis. Some will remain as stem cells and other will become primary spermatocytes, which are also diploid still at this point. These primary spermatocytes undergo meiosis. And after meiosis 1, these become 2 haploid secondary spermatocytes. And then after meiosis 2, they become 4 haploid spermatids. So they go from primary spermatocyte to secondary spermatocyte to spermatids. And then finally the spermatid mature into spermatozoa, which are mature sperm, through the process of spermiogenesis. This is where they get their shape. So the order, one more time, is spermatogonia, primary spermatocyte, secondary spermatocyte, spermatid, spermatozoa. And since this is meiosis, if you remember from last episode, 1 primary spermatocyte will give 4 sperm. Now, I'm going to do a brief overview of the sperm structure, but it's definitely helpful to look at the diagram that I put in the notes, since it's kind of hard to do a structure without having a picture to look at. But they have a very distinct shape. They have a head, which is kind of like an egg or a football shape. It contains the nucleus, which has the genetic material in it, and it's capped by an acrosomal region, or the acrosome. And the acrosome is derived from the Golgi apparatus, and it has enzymes that are needed to penetrate an egg. They have a midpiece, which is just behind the head, and this is packed with mitochondria to generate ATP for movement. And then they have a tail after that, which is the flagellum for motility. And there's another common mnemonic for this, and that's HAT, head, acrosome, tail, although that one doesn't include the midpiece. So I guess it's not a great mnemonic. You can use HAMPT maybe, or HMAT. HMAT, like maybe hazmat, like we need the hazmat team to come clean up these hazardous materials. HMAT. I don't know, you can email me if you think of a better one. But if you just use HAT, don't forget the mitochondrial midpiece, but you should probably use HMAT. That's head, midpiece, acrosomal region, and tail, like hazmat, although it's not quite in the right order. Anyway, That's all we need to cover for the male anatomy. Now, we're going to move on to the female reproductive anatomy, and that's quite a bit more complicated. So the primary gonads are the ovaries in females, which produce estrogen and progesterone. And these contain thousands of follicles. And these follicles are like little sacs containing immature ova or eggs. And the follicles mature through stages. They start as primordial follicles, which are present at birth. And then they develop into primary follicles, then secondary follicles, and finally the mature tertiary or Graafian follicle that's ready to release the primary oocyte during ovulation. Now, it's important to note here that these Graafian follicles, they don't contain a mature ovum, but instead they contain a secondary oocyte that's frozen just before meiosis II. And we'll talk a little more about that here shortly when we get to oogenesis, but it's an important detail. So once a female reaches puberty, typically 1 egg per month is ovulated. That's where it's released from the ovary into the peritoneal sac, which is in the abdominal cavity, and then it's drawn into the fallopian tube or oviduct. And this is typically where fertilization occurs, in the fallopian tube. Now, these tubes are lined with cilia, which are there to help move the egg along, and they're connected to the uterus. If you remember cilia versus flagella, cilia are the ones that are usually moving something across a surface. So this fallopian tube is lined with cilia, they move the egg, and the uterus is where the fertilized egg or embryo will implant and develop. Its lining is called the endometrium, and the lower part is called the cervix, which opens into the vagina. Now, we'll talk exclusively about embryonic development next episode, but for now we're just going to cover the anatomy. And like I said before, with anatomy, I really encourage you to look at the detailed diagram in the show notes just to get an idea of how everything actually looks and where it all is. So let's move on to oogenesis, or egg production. And this actually starts in a female very early in life during fetal development, where the diploid oogonia, or egg-producing stem cells, undergo mitosis to become primary oocytes. These primary oocytes begin meiosis I, but they pause in prophase I, and they stay that way all the way until puberty. So that means all the eggs a female will ever have are already partially formed before birth, but they're arrested in prophase I. And they stay that way until puberty, where roughly every month during menstrual cycle, one primary oocyte is selected to continue the development. And it completes meiosis I with a little bit of a twist. Instead of having a perfectly symmetrical division, the division for meiosis I in the primary oocyte is actually asymmetrical. So instead of forming 2 identical haploid daughter cells, it forms one large secondary oocyte, which gets most of the cytoplasm, and then it forms one small first polar body, which typically degenerates. So the DNA still separates into 2 cells, but one cell gets most of all the cell contents, while the other one gets degraded. Then, after meiosis I, the secondary oocyte will immediately begin meiosis II, but it pauses again, and this time it pauses in metaphase II. And that's the stage it's in when ovulation occurs and it's released from the Graafian follicle. Now, meiosis II is only going to finish if fertilization happens. So this happens actually after fertilization. So the secondary oocyte has 2 outer layers. One's called the zona pellucida, and the other one is called the corona radiata. And a sperm needs to penetrate both of these layers using the acrosomal enzymes in order to fertilize the egg. And once this process happens, that's when meiosis II finishes. So if a sperm penetrates the egg, the secondary oocyte completes meiosis II, forming one mature ovum, which is the functional egg, and it also forms a second polar body, which also degenerates. So again, you end up with one cell that gets most of all the cytoplasm, and another cell that doesn't really get much, and it degenerates. So from one primary oocyte, we ended up with only just one viable egg. And although meiosis starts with one cell but yields 4 cells at the end, in this case, we started with just one cell, and we ended up with only one cell, because at each step, all the resources went into one primary daughter cell. So, they say it's not good to keep all your eggs in one basket, but I guess we do keep all of our oocytes in one basket, huh? And I guess bad jokes means it's time to move on. So let's talk about how reproductive function is actually controlled. And so this next section applies to both males and females. Reproduction is controlled by something called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, and that's abbreviated the HPG axis. And so, as you might guess from the name, it involves your hypothalamus, your pituitary gland, which are both located in your brain, and the gonads. Starting at puberty, the hypothalamus will release gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH, and GnRH is going to trigger the anterior pituitary to release FSH, or follicle-stimulating hormone, and also LH, which is luteinizing hormone. FSH and LH are going to travel through your body to the gonads, so that's either the testes in males or the ovaries in females, and then the gonads are going to respond by producing gametes and sex hormones. So those hormones are going to be testosterone in males and estrogen and progesterone in females. And this whole axis is regulated by negative feedback. So generally speaking, when levels of testosterone in males or estrogen and progesterone in females get high enough, they signal back to the hypothalamus and the pituitary to decrease the release of GnRH, FSH, and LH. So that's negative feedback. And we'll talk more about feedbacks when we get to the endocrine system, but it's negative feedback that's generally involved in this system. And then additionally, inhibin, which is produced by Sertoli cells in males and the granulosa cells in the developing follicles in females, specifically targets the anterior pituitary to inhibit the release of FSH. So testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin all work to decrease the release of GnRH, FSH, and LH. So when the hypothalamus increases its release of GnRH, and remember that's gonadotropin releasing hormone, it's going to kick off puberty. And like we just went over, this ramps up FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary, and this tells the gonads to produce more sex hormones. So FSH and LH are still very important after puberty. In males, FSH stimulates Sertoli cells for sperm maturation, and LH stimulates Leydig cells to make testosterone. And of course, testosterone is what maintains the male organs and the secondary characteristics like facial hair, body hair, deep voice, and muscle growth. These hormones are also important for females after puberty. FSH stimulates ovarian follicle development. If you remember, the primary, then secondary, and tertiary are Graafian follicles. That's all stimulated by FSH, the development there. And these follicles also produce estrogen. And estrogen drives the female secondary characteristics, and that's breast development, hip widening, and fat distribution. Estrogen also develops the reproductive tract, and it thickens the uterine lining or the endometrium, so it's very important to maintain all the reproductive organs. After ovulation, what's left of the follicle is now called the corpus luteum. If you remember, the follicle is what releases the oocyte. After it does that, it's called the corpus luteum, and it produces a hormone called progesterone. And progesterone's main role is preparing and maintaining the endometrium for pregnancy. So estrogen establishes and progesterone protects the endometrium. And it's worth mentioning that in females, the process of estrogen production by the follicles goes like this. First, LH stimulates the theca cells, which are on the outer layer of the follicle, to produce androgens. And these androgens, which are hormones that are kind of similar to testosterone, they then diffuse into granulosa cells, which are the inner cells of the follicle. And then FSH actually stimulates these granulosa cells to convert these androgens into estrogen using the enzyme aromatase. So I'll go over the process one more time. LH stimulates theca cells. They make androgens, which travel to granulosa cells, and the granulosa cells are driven by the FSH signal to convert androgens into estrogen using the aromatase enzyme. Now, the last thing I want to cover in this episode is the menstrual cycle, and this is typically 28 days long on average, but of course people are different, so there's some variability from person to person, and cycles can normally range from about 21 to 35 days. But I'm going to go through this cycle using a 28-day average as a guide because that's kind of what the textbook figures all go by. And I'm going to talk you through this, but it's another section where it's super helpful to look at the guide that I put in the show notes because it gives you a great visual breakdown of how the hormones and actions happen over that 28-day cycle. So days 1 through 14 of the cycle are called the follicular phase, and this starts with the menses phase, which are typically days 1 through 7, and that's the shedding of the old uterine lining through the vagina, and that results in menstrual bleeding. And this is shedding due to low estrogen and progesterone. So the low estrogen and progesterone means less negative feedback on the hypothalamus, so GnRH levels are going to rise, and those are going to stimulate FSH and LH from the pituitary, and from there, FSH is going to stimulate several follicles to grow, and these follicles are going to start making estrogen. So as the estrogen rises, this is going to drive what's called the proliferative phase, and those are days 7 through 14. And that's when the endometrium starts to rebuild itself. And as I mentioned before, normally estrogen gives negative feedback on GnRH, FSH, and LH. But when estrogen is high and sustained for several days, like in the late follicular phase, it actually switches to positive feedback. I know it's kind of confusing that estrogen is acting as a negative feedback, but then if it's a lot and for a long time, then it's all of a sudden it's positive feedback, but that's kind of just how it works. And that's in the late follicular phase. So this positive feedback from high estrogen leads to a massive LH surge and a smaller FSH surge around day 14. And this is what triggers the release of the secondary oocyte from the dominant follicle, and you have ovulation. So if you look at LH on day 14, there's a large peak for it, and you can actually buy over-the-counter tests for ovulation, and they work by detecting LH in urine. So this will tell you when someone is ovulating, which is essentially when they are most likely to get pregnant. So starting at day 14, which is halfway through the cycle, we enter what's called the luteal phase, and this goes from day 14 to day 28. So the second half is called the luteal phase. The first half was called the follicular phase. The second half is called the luteal phase, and this is where high LH causes the ruptured follicle to become what's called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is what secretes high levels of progesterone and moderate estrogen to maintain that endometrium. Remember, it's progesterone that maintains the endometrium. So progesterone makes the endometrium secretory, or thick, vascular, nutrient-rich, and ready for implantation. And this is the secretory phase of the uterine cycle. So next, high progesterone and estrogen are going to cause strong negative feedback, and it's going to suppress GnRH, FSH, and LH, preventing new follicles. So next we can have a few different things that can happen depending on whether or not there was fertilization. Now remember, this is anywhere between day 14 and day 28, but if there's no fertilization, without LH, the corpus luteum is going to degenerate into what's called the corpus albicans, and progesterone and estrogen levels are going to plummet. And this big drop is going to trigger menstruation or shedding of the lining. It removes that negative feedback, allowing GnRH to rise, and it's going to start the cycle all over again. So it's every 28 days that's going to happen. If there's no fertilization, the cycle is going to start over again. If fertilization does occur, the developing blastocyst, which is the term for the early embryo, which we're going to talk about next episode, it's going to implant in the uterus, and its outer layer, which is called the syncytiotropoblast, is going to start secreting HCG, or human chorionic gonadotropin. And HCG works like LH, and it maintains the corpus luteum during the first trimester. And remember, that was the ruptured follicle that dropped the oocyte. That became the corpus luteum. So this HCG is going to maintain this corpus luteum during the first trimester, and the corpus luteum is going to keep making progesterone, which is crucial for maintaining the pregnancy because it's crucial for keeping the endometrium good to go. And in the second trimester, HCG levels are going to fall because the placenta actually makes its own estrogen and progesterone, and so the corpus luteum at that point will atrophy. And this covers everything we're going to cover for the menstruation cycle, but like I said before, it's super helpful to look at the diagram because I know I said there are several different stages there because there's kind of two main stages, and then there's a few sub-stages of each of those. Everything should be pretty clear on the chart. It has the hormone levels and everything. You've probably seen one of these before in your class, but I would say definitely take a look at it if you haven't. The key things to know for the MCAT on the graph are key peaks. Estrogen peaks just before ovulation on around day 13. LH and FSH peak at ovulation around day 14, and progesterone peaks mid-luteal phase around day 21. So I have a quick note about birth control. A lot of hormonal birth control pills contain progesterone or synthetic progestins, and this maintains that negative feedback, suppressing FSH and LH, and it prevents ovulation. So it's kind of tricking the body into thinking it's already pregnant in a way. And this menstrual cycle eventually stops happening between the ages of 45 and 55, give or take. And this is when women go through what's called menopause, which happens because over time, the ovaries become less sensitive to FSH and LH, and they eventually atrophy. And also remember, females have a set number of eggs when they're born, and they don't make any more after fetal development. So during menopause, menstruation will stop without the estrogen and progesterone feedback. The levels of FSH and LH are going to rise significantly. And this hormonal shift will sometimes cause symptoms like hot flashes or irritability, etc. And I'm going to leave out any corny jokes I had planned for this section. So that's just going to wrap up this episode. So let's do a quick key terms recap for today's episode. So some of the things we talked about today. So for sex determination, XX is female, XY is male. Males are hemizygous, and they have the SRY gene. That's the sex-determining region Y. For the male anatomy, we had that 7-up mnemonic, which was seminiferous tubules, epididymis, vas deferens, ejaculatory duct, urethra, and penis. For the sperm structure, we had HMAT or hazmat, head, midpiece, acrosomal region, and tail. We talked about spermatogenesis, which is just like regular meiosis. You make 4 cells from 1. And for the female system, we talked about the ovaries, which have thousands of these follicles, which develop into primary follicles, then secondary follicles, then tertiary or Graafian follicles. The path that an oocyte takes goes through the peritoneal sac, then the fallopian tube or the oviduct, then the uterus. The uterus lining is called the endometrium. And during oogenesis, it has 2 different divisions that are asymmetrical. So from oogenesis, you start with 1 primary oocyte, and you end up with 1 secondary oocyte, and both steps of meiosis are frozen until certain things happen. So meiosis 1 is frozen in prophase 1 until puberty and an ovulation event occurs for that egg, and then meiosis 2 is frozen until the egg is fertilized. We talked about the HPG axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. And just quickly, the hypothalamus releases GnRH. GnRH triggers the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. Those go to the gametes to produce sex hormones. An increased release of GnRH is going to kick off puberty. In males, those hormones will make testosterone. In females, they'll trigger the production of estrogen and progesterone. And then we finished up talking about the menstrual cycle. The first half is called the follicular phase. The second half is the luteal phase. And during the follicular phase, you have this cycle where GnRH levels rise, FSH and LH rise, and then FSH stimulates follicles to grow. A large LH surge is going to trigger ovulation. The ruptured follicle is going to become the corpus luteum, which produces the progesterone to maintain the endometrium. And then negative feedback from progesterone and estrogen are going to suppress GnRH, FSH, LH, and then without fertilization, this all just happens again. If fertilization does occur, the blastocyst will create HCG, which maintains the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum will then continue to create progesterone until the placenta takes over and makes its own estrogen and progesterone. So, I know that was a big wrap-up, and they take a lot of time, so please let me know if you want me to keep doing them or not. Otherwise, I can just end the episode without doing the wrap-ups. I think they're probably helpful just to hit the key terms one more time, but please give me some feedback and let me know. Mark@reviewmcat.com. If I made any mistakes or mispronounced anything, I am very sorry. Let me know. I can correct any mistakes. mark@reviewmcat.com. That's my email address. Come by the website and see what's new. And please, if you enjoy the show, share it with a friend and leave us a 5-star review wherever you found us. So, keep reviewing, keep practicing. You're doing great. I'm glad I got to review with you today. So, I hope to study again with you soon. Ta-ta for now.